On March 16, 2026, President Trump posted something that at the time barely made a ripple in the news cycle. He accused Iran of spreading false information using artificial intelligence. He said Tehran was generating fake images and videos to fabricate military successes that never actually happened. He specifically pointed to a viral image showing the American aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln burning at sea and declared it fake and that the ship was never attacked. He even suggested American media outlets that reported on possible damage to US military assets should face what he called serious consequences for spreading false information. That was March. Now let me take you to July 26, 2026, just 4 months later. The United States had just paused its bombing campaign after 13 consecutive days of strikes on Iran. And on that Sunday afternoon, President Trump sat at his own account and posted a stream of artificial intelligence generated images. One showed fighter jets bombing an Iranian oil facility, captioned "Strike" on Kharg, referring to Kharg Island, Iran's main oil export hub. Another showed Trump himself standing on the deck of what appears to be an Iranian tanker, holding an American flag, with an Iranian flag lying beneath him, captioned "It's our tanker now." A third was captioned "No more engines," showing an Iranian ship exploding. None of these events had actually happened. These were entirely artificial intelligence generated fabrications posted by the President of the United States during an active pause in military operations. The man who spent March accusing Iran of exactly this tactic spent July doing precisely the same thing himself. And I do not think that irony is an accident. I think it tells you something extremely important about the actual state of this war that neither government wants to say out loud. Let me introduce the framework I am using today because I think it captures something genuinely universal about how modern wars are actually being fought right now. I call it the mirror war. Here is the core idea. When a government begins generating fabricated images of military success, rather than simply reporting real strikes, it is almost never a sign of strength. It is a sign that the gap between what a government wants the public to believe and what its actual military capacity can currently deliver has become too wide to bridge with real footage alone. Trump accused Iran of this exact behavior in March precisely because it fit a familiar wartime pattern. A weaker military power compensates for what it cannot achieve on the battlefield by manufacturing the appearance of achieving it anyway. What makes July so revealing is that the same tactic is now being deployed by the stronger power in this conflict at the exact moment its own military logistics appear to be running into real constraints. The mirror war framework says this: once both sides in a conflict are relying on fabricated imagery to project strength, you are no longer simply watching a war of missiles and airstrikes. You are watching two governments, each quietly signaling through their propaganda choices that their real capacity to continue fighting has become more limited than either wants to admit. Now let me walk you through the actual evidence, because I want to show you this is not simply clever coincidence. This is a pattern that lines up very precisely once you lay it out chronologically. First, look at exactly why the pause happened in the first place. The United States halted its bombing campaign late on Friday, July 24th, after 13 consecutive days of strikes against Iran. According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal, senior White House officials had specifically raised concerns about depleted stockpiles of American missiles. Trump had reportedly called senior Pentagon officials and top military contractors to the White House back in June, specifically because of munition supply concerns. This was not a spontaneous goodwill gesture toward diplomacy. This was a pause that followed direct internal warnings from Trump's own officials about running out of both targets to strike and the missiles needed to strike them. Second, look at the actual stockpile numbers, because these are not vague estimates. According to recent assessments, the United States military has used at least 1,500 Patriot missiles since the war with Iran began, leaving only approximately 1,000 remaining in the entire national stockpile. A report published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies back in May found that Tomahawk, THAAD, and Patriot missile stockpiles could take between 3 and 5 years to fully replace given current production capacity. 3 to 5 years. That is not a temporary supply hiccup. That is a structural limitation on how long the United States can sustain this specific type of high-intensity air and missile campaign without drawing down capacity needed for other potential theaters, including the Pacific. Third, and this is the detail that I think deserves far more attention than it has received. NBC News reported that American commanders in the Middle East have reached a point where they are selectively shooting down Iranian missiles due to a lack of interceptor missiles. Read that carefully. Selectively. This means American commanders are now making real-time decisions about which incoming Iranian missiles to intercept and which ones to simply let through because there are not enough interceptors available to stop every single incoming threat. That is an extraordinary admission buried in a single news report while the president was simultaneously posting fabricated images claiming the United States has far more munitions than anyone in the world and far more than we need. Fourth, look at what Trump actually said when directly confronted with these reports. He told the Wall Street Journal on the record that the United States has far more munitions than anyone in the world and far more than we need. That statement was made in the same general time frame as the NBC reporting about selective interception due to interceptor shortages. Both of these things cannot simultaneously be true in any straightforward sense. Either the stockpile concerns being reported by multiple independent outlets are wrong, or the public denial is doing exactly what fabricated imagery does, which is closing the gap between visible confidence and actual military reality through message management rather than through verifiable fact. Fifth, look at the specific content and timing of the AI-generated images themselves, because I think the choices reveal exactly what audience they were built for. The Kharg Island strike image threatens Iran's single most important oil export facility, precisely the kind of target that would represent a major real-world escalation if it actually happened. The image of Trump standing on an Iranian tanker deck with the caption, "It's our tanker," now projects a fantasy of total naval dominance over the exact waterway where the United States has actually struggled to maintain uncontested control throughout this entire war. These are not random propaganda images. They are specifically engineered to visually resolve the two areas where the real war has gone worse for the United States so far. Energy infrastructure strikes that have not actually happened at this scale, and maritime dominance over Hormuz that has not actually been achieved given how many ship attacks have continued despite the blockade. Sixth, I want to bring in the Iranian side of this equation, because the mirror war framework only works if you can show the same underlying pattern from both directions. Iran has held its own fire since July 26th, explicitly stating it will continue to do so for as long as the United States does. This is being widely described as an informal quiet for quiet understanding, with Oman continuing to broker efforts around a more formal arrangement concerning the strait. But here is what almost nobody has connected. Iran's own economy is simultaneously showing the kind of strain that would make continued open-ended conflict increasingly difficult to sustain regardless of what happens with any formal ceasefire. When both sides have separate and serious reasons to want a pause at the exact same moment that they are each individually experiencing internal strain, the diplomatic space that opens up is not really about either side achieving victory. It is about both sides needing time to rebuild capacity they have each quietly exhausted. Seventh, and this is a detail that adds a genuinely new dimension almost nobody has folded into the broader Iran war narrative. On approximately July 25th, Ukraine carried out what its own president, Volodymyr Zelensky, described as long-range strikes in the Caspian Sea, specifically targeting vessels used in military cargo shipments involving Iran. One Iranian sailor was killed and another injured. Iran's foreign ministry condemned the attack, and Foreign Minister Araghchi stated publicly that it cannot go unanswered. Think about what this means for the broader picture. In the middle of an American-Iranian pause, explicitly described as giving diplomacy some space, a third country, entirely unconnected to the direct American-Israeli-Iranian conflict, opened an entirely new front against Iranian shipping in a completely different body of water. Ukraine has spent years countering Iranian-designed drones deployed by Russia in its own war, and has reportedly offered its drone interception expertise to Middle Eastern countries that have suffered Iranian strikes. This is not simply a coincidental, unrelated incident. It is a sign that the broader coalition of countries with grievances against Iran is expanding the geography of pressure against Tehran, even during a moment when the primary combatants are trying to create room for negotiation. Eighth, look at what happened to the official American casualty count around this same period. Reporting has noted that the Pentagon's official Iran war death toll no longer lists 4 troops who were previously reported killed during a period of renewed fighting. A quiet downward revision to an official casualty figure during a war that the administration is simultaneously trying to publicly frame through triumphant fabricated imagery is exactly the kind of information management detail the Mirror War framework predicts you would find if you looked closely enough. Managing the visible cost of a war domestically through casualty count revisions, and managing the visible success of a war internationally through fabricated strike imagery are two sides of the exact same underlying strategy of controlling perception when the underlying reality has become harder to sustain than officials want to publicly admit. Ninth, I want to bring in a historical parallel because I think it sharpens exactly what is happening here. During the final stages of the Vietnam War, American military briefers in Saigon became so notorious for issuing overly optimistic and frequently fabricated combat reports that journalists covering the war began calling the daily press briefings the 5 O'Clock Follies. Officers would present body counts and territorial gains that bore little resemblance to what reporters were actually observing in the field. Historians studying that period have generally concluded that the gap between official briefing room confidence and battlefield reality widened specifically as American logistics and troop morale began deteriorating rather than narrowing as the war dragged on. The lesson from that era is not that governments lie constantly throughout every war. The lesson is that the volume and creativity of official propaganda tends to increase specifically at the exact moments when the underlying military position is weakening rather than strengthening. Confident militaries with ample resources generally do not need elaborate fabricated imagery because the real footage already tells the story they want told. It is only when the real footage stops cooperating with the desired narrative that fabrication becomes strategically necessary. 10th, I want to look briefly at how quickly independent fact checkers and even some sympathetic commentators move to identify the Trump images as artificially generated within hours of posting, because this tells you something about how differently fabricated imagery functions in 2026 compared to even a few years earlier. Multiple outlets across the political spectrum immediately labeled the Kharg Island and tanker images as AI generated rather than treating them as ambiguous or requiring extended verification. This rapid consensus identification actually undercuts the traditional purpose fabricated war imagery has historically served throughout modern conflict. If an image can be reliably identified as artificial within hours, by observers across the political spectrum, its primary value shifts away from genuinely deceiving anyone about battlefield events and towards simply generating engagement and signaling defiance to a domestic base that already assumes such content is more performance than documentation. That shift matters because it tells you the intended audience for these specific images was probably never international observers or Iranian officials at all. It was almost certainly aimed entirely at the domestic base that Trump needed to reassure precisely when reports about depleted stockpiles were beginning to circulate widely. So when you put these 10 pieces of evidence together, the picture that emerges is genuinely striking. A president who spent March accusing Iran of fabricating war imagery spent July doing precisely the same thing himself. At the exact moment, credible, independent reporting revealed real interceptor shortages, real selective missile defense decisions, and a real internally driven pause caused by depleted stockpiles rather than a confident diplomatic breakthrough. Meanwhile, a third country entirely outside the primary conflict opened a new front against Iranian shipping during the exact window both primary combatants were trying to create space for talks. And the official casualty record was quietly revised downward during the same general period the fabricated victory imagery was being posted. Now, let me steelman the opposing view because I always try to do this honestly. You could argue that comparing Trump's AI-generated posts to a genuine information warfare campaign is unfair and overstates what is really just typical political bravado. Presidents and political figures have always used exaggerated rhetoric and imagery to project strength domestically. These posts could simply be understood as entertainment-adjacent political content similar to other viral AI-generated posts Trump shared in the same social media spree, mocking late-night hosts and promoting his own branding. Under this reading, the Iran-related images are not a calculated information operation at all. They are simply one category of content within a broader pattern of Trump using AI-generated memes across many unrelated topics simultaneously. The munitions concerns are real and separately reported, but the AI images themselves may just reflect a personal communication style rather than a deliberate strategic information campaign designed to mask military weakness. That is a fair point, and I do not want to dismiss it entirely. But here is what that argument struggles to explain. If these images were purely incidental entertainment content, unrelated to any strategic messaging need, why did they specifically target the two precise areas where independent reporting shows the real war effort has struggled the most? Energy infrastructure strikes on Kharg Island that have not actually occurred at the scale depicted, and total naval dominance over Hormuz that multiple ship attacks throughout July demonstrate has not actually been achieved. Random entertainment content would not consistently cluster around exactly the two most militarily sensitive gaps between stated confidence and documented reality. The specificity of the targeting inside these fabricated images is precisely what makes the mirror war framework the more compelling explanation, even if the broader posting spree also included unrelated content about late-night television hosts. Now let me bring in the player who benefits most from exactly this kind of moment, because it is once again China watching from a position of considerable patience. Every report confirming real American interceptor shortages and multi-year replacement timelines for core missile systems like Patriot and THAAD is information that shapes how Beijing calculates its own long-term posture in any future confrontation over Taiwan or the South China Sea. China does not need to comment publicly on Trump's AI-generated Iran images at all. It simply needs to note quietly that the same stockpile constraints being revealed through this Iran conflict would apply with even greater severity in any larger and more sustained confrontation across the Pacific. Every week that American munitions production struggles to keep pace with actual combat consumption in the Middle East is a week that reinforces exactly the kind of long-term calculation Chinese military planners have reportedly been building their own strategic timelines around for years. Let me give you 4 specific things to watch over the coming days, because this is how we test whether the mirror war framework actually holds up against what happens next. First, watch whether the quiet for quiet pause holds for more than a week, or whether either side breaks it, citing a violation by the other. A pause driven primarily by genuine logistics constraints rather than a real diplomatic breakthrough would be expected to be fragile and short-lived, precisely because the underlying military pressures pushing toward escalation have not actually been resolved. Second, watch whether the Pentagon issues any further quiet revisions to official casualty figures or munitions inventory statements in the coming weeks, because a pattern of downward casualty revisions alongside upward rhetorical confidence would further confirm the information management dynamic this analysis suggests is underway. Third, watch how Iran responds to the Ukrainian Caspian Sea strike, specifically because Araghchi's promise that it cannot go unanswered raises the question of whether Iran opens some form of retaliatory front against Ukrainian interests, even while holding fire against the United States and Israel, which would represent a genuinely new and dangerous branch of this broader conflict. Fourth, watch whether any additional AI-generated imagery from Trump's account specifically targets Kharg Island again, or introduces new fabricated content depicting successful interception of Iranian missiles, because a repeated focus on exactly the same 2 vulnerable areas, that these are not random entertainment posts, but a deliberate and repeated attempt to visually paper over the specific gaps independent reporting keeps exposing. Fifth, watch the fact-checking response time to any future AI-generated imagery Trump posts about this conflict, because a shrinking gap between posting and public identification as fabricated would confirm that this entire category of content has become a recognized and almost ritualized signal of domestic-based messaging, rather than a genuine attempt at strategic deception aimed at Tehran or the wider world. For your homework this week, I want you to go read the original March 16th statement, in which Trump accused Iran of exactly this same tactic, and place it side by side with the actual AI-generated images he posted on July 26th. Read them back to back and notice how closely the underlying accusation from March maps onto the actual behavior in July. Then go find the NBC News reporting on selective missile interception due to interceptor shortages, and read it alongside Trump's Wall Street Journal statement claiming abundant munitions. Ask yourself honestly which version of events the verifiable evidence actually supports. So let me leave you with the actual question I think matters most after everything we have gone through today. Everyone keeps asking whether this pause represents a genuine step toward peace or simply a temporary lull before renewed escalation. I think that is the wrong question given everything the evidence actually shows us. The right question is this: when the exact tactic a government spent months publicly condemning as enemy propaganda becomes the same tactic that government adopts for itself, the moment its own military reality falls short of its public rhetoric, what does that tell you about which side of any modern conflict is actually running out of road first? Because fabricated victory images are never really evidence of strength. Historically, they have always been the exhaust fumes of a machine that is quietly beginning to run out of fuel. And the deeper irony sitting underneath all of this is that both governments in this conflict now understand something about each other that neither one can say out loud in a press conference. Tehran knows Washington's stockpile concerns are real, because Iranian commanders are the ones watching which incoming missiles get intercepted and which ones are allowed through. And Washington knows Iran's economic strain is real for exactly the same reason it accused Tehran of fabricating imagery back in March. Each side has spent months studying the other closely enough to recognize genuine weakness the moment it appears. The only audience still being managed through fabricated confidence on either side is not the enemy across the negotiating table. It is each government's own public back home. Think about that. I will see you in the next one.